September 10th, 1931. The phone rings in a Brooklyn social club at exactly 9:47 in the evening. A man answers, listens for 3 seconds, and hangs up. He looks at his associates, nods once, and says 2 words. Clean house. Within the next 6 hours, from New York to Chicago, from Detroit to Philadelphia, from New Orleans to Los Angeles, the old guard of the American Mafia would be systematically eliminated in what remains the most coordinated act of organized violence in criminal history. This was not chaos. This was not revenge. This was Charles Lucky Luciano rewriting the rules of power itself. And the blood spilled that night would cement a new order that would dominate American organized crime for the next 50 years. To understand what happened on that September night, you must first understand what the American underworld looked like in 1931, and more importantly, who controlled it. The Italian criminal organizations that had emerged from the waves of immigration at the turn of the century were still operating under old world traditions. The bosses, they called them Mustache Petes, old men who had brought the codes and customs of Sicily and southern Italy to American soil. They ruled their territories like medieval lords, demanding tribute, settling disputes through violence, and maintaining strict ethnic boundaries. They looked down on younger criminals who had grown up in America. They refused to work with Irish gangs, Jewish syndicates, or anyone outside their own blood. They saw the underworld as a feudal system where respect, tradition, and fear were the only currencies that mattered. But there was a problem with their worldview. It was 1931. America was in the grip of prohibition. There were billions of dollars flowing through illegal alcohol distribution, gambling, prostitution, labor racketeering, and narcotics. The old bosses were content with their neighborhoods, their street taxes, their small-time operations. They could not see or refused to see that the modern criminal enterprise required modern thinking. It required organization, cooperation across ethnic lines, rational business decisions, and most critically, it required someone willing to kill the past to build the future. That someone was Charles Luciano, though by 1931 everyone called him Lucky. Born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily in 1897, he arrived in New York as a child and grew up in the tenements of the Lower East Side. By his teenage years, he was already working in the streets, running numbers, protecting card games, learning the mechanics of criminal enterprise from the ground up. What set Lucky apart was not his capacity for violence, though he was certainly capable of it, but his capacity for strategy. While other young thugs were content being muscle, Lucky was studying the system. He understood that crime was business, and business required efficiency, partnerships, and the elimination of anything that stood in the way of profit. By the late 1920s, Lucky had become a key figure in the bootlegging operations that supplied New York with illegal alcohol. He worked with everyone: Jews like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Irish gangsters, Italian crews from different families. This made him valuable but also dangerous in the eyes of the old guard. The traditional bosses saw him as a threat to their authority, a young upstart who did not respect the old ways. Lucky saw them as obstacles to progress, dinosaurs who would rather maintain their pride than expand their wealth. The two most powerful of these old bosses were Giuseppe Joe, the boss Masseria, and Salvatore Maranzano. These men represented everything that was wrong with the old system. Masseria controlled much of Manhattan and Brooklyn, ruling through intimidation and demanding absolute loyalty. Maranzano, who arrived from Sicily in 1925, saw himself as a Caesar, structuring his organization along Roman military lines and dreaming of becoming the boss of all bosses, the capo di tutti capi. Between 1930 and 1931, these two men waged a brutal war for supremacy known as the Castellamarese War, named after Maranzano's hometown in Sicily. Young soldiers were killed in the streets, businesses were burned, The violence was attracting federal attention and disrupting the money flow that kept the entire underworld profitable. Lucky Luciano found himself nominally aligned with Mafia, but he was playing a deeper game. He understood that neither Mafia nor Maranzano represented the future. Both were authoritarian relics who would never accept the kind of corporate structure that modern organized crime required. Lucky began having secret meetings with younger, more pragmatic mobsters. Meyer Lansky, his closest confidant and business partner. Frank Costello, the smooth political fixer. Vito Genovese, ambitious and ruthless. Joe Adonis, who controlled the Brooklyn waterfront. These men shared Lucky's vision. They wanted to end the war, eliminate the old guard, and establish a new order based on business principles rather than feudal traditions. The first move came in April of 1931. Lucky arranged a meeting with Masseria at a Coney Island restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro. They ate, they talked, and after lunch, Lucky excused himself to use the restroom. While he was gone, 4 gunmen entered the restaurant and shot Joe the boss Masseria to death. The executioners were carefully chosen. Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel. A mix of Italian and Jewish killers, a deliberate message that the new order would transcend the ethnic boundaries the old bosses held sacred. With Masseria dead, the Castellamarese War appeared to be over. Maranzano had won, but Lucky Luciano knew something Maranzano did not. The war was not over. It was about to enter its final phase. Maranzano immediately declared himself the boss of all bosses and restructured the New York families into 5 distinct organizations, a structure that still exists today. The Bonanno family, the Colombo family, the Gambino family, the Genovese family, and the Lucchese family. He appointed lieutenants and captains, issued orders, and demanded absolute obedience. He was replicating the hierarchical system he knew from Sicily, just on a grander scale. What Maranzano failed to understand was that Lucky and his allies had not eliminated Masseria to install another dictator. They had eliminated Masseria to end the dictatorship model entirely. Within months, Lucky learned that Maranzano was planning to kill him. The new boss of bosses saw Lucky as too independent, too powerful, too willing to work with non-Italians. Maranzano had drawn up a list of enemies to eliminate, and Lucky Luciano was at the top. But Lucky was always 3 moves ahead. He was not going to wait to be purged. He was going to strike first, and he was not going to stop with Maranzano. He was going to eliminate every old guard boss who represented the authoritarian traditionalist model of organized crime. He was going to clean house across the entire country in a single night of coordinated violence that would leave no doubt about who controlled the future. The planning was meticulous. Lucky called a meeting with his most trusted associates. Meyer Lansky brought his analytical mind and his connections to Jewish syndicates across the country. Frank Costello provided political cover and a network of corrupt officials who could be counted on to look the other way. Vito Genovese offered manpower and a willingness to do what needed to be done. Together they compiled intelligence on every old guard boss in every major city. They identified who needed to be eliminated, where they could be found, and who could be trusted to carry out the hits simultaneously. This was not going to be a purge driven by revenge or emotion. This was going to be a surgical operation executed with military precision. The first target was obvious. Salvatore Maranzano had to die, and his death had to be decisive and symbolic. On September 10, 1931, 4 men dressed as federal agents entered Maranzano's office in the Grand Central Building in Manhattan. They flashed badges, announced they were conducting a raid, and ordered everyone in the office to line up against the wall. Once they had control of the room, they pulled out guns and knives and attacked Maranzano. They shot him multiple times and stabbed him repeatedly, ensuring there would be no doubt about the message. The boss of all bosses was dead, killed by men pretending to be law enforcement, a deliberate irony that underscored the new order's sophistication. Meyer Lansky had reportedly provided some of the killers, Jewish gangsters with no ties to the Italian families, men who could not be traced back through traditional mob connections. But the killing of Maranzano was only the beginning. As his body cooled in that Manhattan office, the phone calls went out. Clean house. Across America in nearly every major city with an organized Italian criminal presence, the purge began. The targets were the Mustache Petes, the old bosses who still clung to Sicilian traditions, who refused to cooperate with other ethnic groups, who saw the underworld as a zero-sum game rather than a business opportunity. These men had names that once commanded fear. In Brooklyn, several old guard captains who had served under Masseria and refused to accept Lucky's authority were ambushed in social clubs and killed. In Chicago, where Al Capone's organization was already in decline, several traditional Sicilian bosses who had maintained independent operations were executed. In Detroit, the Licavoli family members who represented the old school approach were targeted. In Philadelphia, in Newark, in Buffalo, the pattern repeated. Cars pulled up. Gunmen entered homes and businesses. Shots were fired. Bodies fell. The exact number of men killed that night and in the days immediately following has been debated by historians and crime researchers for decades. Some accounts claim as many as 40 bosses and high-ranking mafiosi were eliminated. Others suggest the number was closer to 20 or 30. What is not debated is the impact. In a single coordinated operation, Lucky Luciano and his allies decapitated the old guard leadership structure across the American Mafia. The message was unmistakable. The age of the Mustache Petes was over. The age of the corporate mob had begun. What makes this purge historically significant is not just the violence, but the philosophy behind it. Lucky Luciano was not trying to become the next dictator. He was not declaring himself boss of all bosses. In fact, he was eliminating that title entirely. What Lucky envisioned, and what he successfully implemented in the aftermath of the purge, was something far more sophisticated. He created what would become known as the Commission, a board of directors for organized crime. The commission consisted of representatives from the major crime families in New York and other cities. They would meet regularly to resolve disputes, approve major operations, divide territories, and make decisions that affected the entire underworld. No single boss would have absolute power. Decisions would be made collectively based on what was best for business, not what satisfied someone's ego or honored some ancient Sicilian vendetta. This was revolutionary. Lucky Luciano essentially invented the modern mafia structure. He took a collection of violent street gangs operating under medieval traditions and transformed them into a rational, organized corporate entity. He established rule. No killing without commission approval. No dealing drugs, at least officially, because it attracted too much law enforcement attention. No messing with civilian businesses unless they were involved in illegal activity. Disputes would be arbitrated, not settled with bullets. The families would cooperate on large-scale operations, sharing profits and resources. And most importantly, ethnicity would not be a barrier to business. The Italian families would work with Jewish syndicates, Irish gangs, and anyone else who could contribute to the bottom line. The impact of these changes cannot be overstated. Within a few years of the purge, the American Mafia had evolved from a chaotic collection of ethnic street gangs into a sophisticated criminal enterprise that would infiltrate labor unions, control gambling operations across the country, dominate the heroin trade, rig elections, corrupt politicians, and generate billions of dollars in illegal revenue. Lucky Luciano's vision made this possible. By eliminating the old guard and implementing a corporate structure, he created an organization that could survive leadership changes, adapt to legal pressure, and operate efficiently across state and national borders. But history demands a price for power, and Lucky Luciano would pay it. His success made him a target. By the mid-1930s, law enforcement officials, particularly New York prosecutor Thomas Dewey, began building cases against the major mob figures. Dewey was ambitious, brilliant, and utterly incorruptible, a rare combination in an era where organized crime had deep political connections. He could not get lucky on bootlegging or murder. Those operations were too well insulated, but Dewey found another angle. In 1936, he charged Lucky Luciano with running a massive prostitution ring. The evidence was circumstantial. The witnesses were coerced prostitutes and small-time criminals, and the trial was arguably a miscarriage of justice. But Dewey got his conviction. In June of 1936, Lucky Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. Even from behind bars, Lucky remained influential. He continued to receive visitors, pass messages, and guide the commission's decisions. During World War II, an extraordinary thing happened. The United States government, desperate to prevent sabotage on the New York waterfront and needing intelligence for the Allied invasion of Sicily, approached Lucky Luciano for help. Through Meyer Lansky and other intermediaries, Lucky used his connections to ensure the docks remained secure and provided valuable contacts in Sicily for military intelligence. In exchange, his sentence was commuted, but there was a condition. He would be deported to Italy and never allowed to return to the United States. In 1946, Lucky Luciano left America forever, exiled to Italy where he would spend the rest of his life. He died in 1962 at the Naples airport, reportedly while meeting associates to discuss business. He was 64 years old. His body was eventually allowed to return to America and was buried in Queens, New York, a final return to the country he had transformed but could never come home to. The legacy of that September night in 1931 is still visible today. The commission structure Lucky created remained the governing body of American organized crime for decades. The 5 families of New York that emerged from the reorganization after Masseria and Maranzano's deaths are still recognized as the foundation of the Italian-American Mafia. The business model Lucky pioneered, treating crime as a rational enterprise rather than a collection of personal vendettas, became the template for organized criminal groups worldwide. Drug cartels, Russian organized crime, Asian triads, all of them learned from the model Lucky Luciano established when he decided to clean house. But beyond the organizational innovations, there is something darker and more profound to consider about what Lucky Luciano did. He proved that violence, when applied strategically and without mercy, can reshape entire systems. The purge of 1931 was not random brutality. It was calculated elimination of obstacles to a new order. 40 men, give or take, were killed in a single coordinated operation because they represented the past, and the past had to die for the future to be born. Lucky did not apologize for it. He did not moralize about it. He understood that power is not given, it is taken, and those who hesitate to take it will be destroyed by those who do not. There is a chilling efficiency to how Lucky Luciano operated. He identified a problem, the old guard bosses who were holding back the evolution of organized crime. He developed a solution, a simultaneous purge followed by a new organizational structure. He assembled the resources needed: loyal associates, skilled killers, political connections. He executed the plan with precision, and then he moved forward without looking back. This is the mindset of someone who understands power at its most fundamental level. Sentimentality is a weakness. Tradition is only valuable if it serves current objectives. People are assets or obstacles, and obstacles must be removed. This raises uncomfortable questions about how systems of power actually function, whether criminal or legitimate. How different was Lucky Luciano's purge from the political purges carried out by governments throughout history? How different was his commission from a corporate board of directors making ruthless business decisions? The violence was more direct, certainly. But the underlying logic, eliminate competition, consolidate control, maximize profit, establish rules that serve the powerful, that logic exists in every power structure. Lucky Luciano simply operated without the veneer of legitimacy, without the pretense that his actions served some higher moral purpose. He was building an empire, and empires are always built on blood. Consider also the men who were killed. They were criminals, certainly violent men who had themselves ordered murders and committed terrible acts. But they were also products of their time and culture. Immigrants who had come to America seeking opportunity and found it in the only economy available to them, the illegal one. They built their organizations according to the rules they knew, the traditions of Sicily and southern Italy. They demanded loyalty, they settled disputes with violence, they maintained ethnic boundaries. All of it was standard practice in their world. And for adhering to those old ways, they were marked for death by a younger generation that saw them as obsolete. There is something tragically Darwinian about it. Adapt or die. Evolve or be eliminated. The future does not care about tradition. The men who carried out the killings that night are also worth considering. They were young, ambitious, willing to kill on command because they believed it would secure their place in the new order. Some of them rose to power and prominence. Others were themselves killed in later power struggles, because the system Lucky created was still fundamentally based on violence, and violence has a way of consuming everyone it touches. Albert Anastasia, one of the men who killed Mafia, would himself be assassinated in a barbershop in 1957. Vito Genovese, Lucky's ally in the purge, would eventually try to seize absolute power and spend his final years in federal prison. Bugsy Siegel, the charismatic killer who helped build the Las Vegas casino empire, was shot to death in Beverly Hills in 1947. The wheel turns. The game continues. Power is always temporary. And what of Meyer Lansky, Lucky's closest friend and the financial genius behind? Much of the mob's success, Lansky survived longer than most, avoiding prison and living until 1983. He never achieved the public notoriety of Lucky or Al Capone, which was precisely his strategy. Stay in the shadows, let others take the spotlight and the risks. Make money, invest wisely, and die peacefully. In many ways, Lansky was the ultimate success story of Lucky's new order. He proved that organized crime, when run as a business rather than a glorified street gang, could generate wealth that lasted generations. The law enforcement response to the purge was telling. Despite the fact that dozens of known criminals were killed in a single night across multiple cities, there were very few arrests and virtually no convictions related to the murders. Why? Because the victims were criminals and because many police departments and political machines were already compromised by corruption. Lucky and his allies had spent years building relationships with politicians, judges, and police officials. They paid bribes, provided campaign contributions, offered favors, and created a network of protection that made prosecuting organized crime figures nearly impossible. This was another aspect of Lucky's genius. He understood that in America, money buys influence, and influence buys protection. It took decades for law enforcement to develop the tools and the political will to seriously challenge the Mafia. The RICO Act, passed in 1970, finally gave prosecutors the ability to charge entire organizations rather than just individual criminals. The use of electronic surveillance, witness protection programs, and federal task forces gradually eroded the mob's power. But even today, more than 90 years after the purge of 1931, the organizational structure Lucky Luciano created still exists. The families are weaker, their leaders are older, their operations are smaller, but the structure remains. That is the power of what Lucky built. It outlasted him by generations. What can we learn from the story of Lucky Luciano and the night he cleaned house? Perhaps it is that innovation, even criminal innovation, requires the destruction of the old order. You cannot build something fundamentally new while the old guard still holds power. They will resist, they will undermine, they will use tradition and authority to maintain their control. Change, real change, requires more than persuasion. It requires force. Lucky understood this. He did not try to convince the Mustache Petes to accept his vision. He eliminated them and implemented his vision over their corpses. Perhaps the lesson is that organization beats chaos every time. The old bosses were powerful individually, but they operated independently, competed with each other, and refused to cooperate. Lucky created a system where the families worked together, shared information, resolved conflicts through arbitration, and focused on making money rather than defending honor. That system proved far more powerful and durable than any individual boss could be. Structure matters. Rules matter. Cooperation matters, even among criminals. Perhaps the lesson is that violence, terrible as it is, can be a tool for creating order. Before the Purge, the American underworld was in chaos. The Castellammarese War had killed dozens and attracted federal attention. After the Purge, there was a brutal peace. The Commission settled disputes before they became wars. The families focused on business rather than vendetta. Civilian casualties dropped because the mob operated more professionally. It is an uncomfortable truth, but the coordinated violence of that September night may have prevented far more violence in the years that followed. Order, even an order built on cream, is sometimes preferable to chaos. Or perhaps the lesson is darker still. Perhaps Lucky Luciano's story teaches us that morality is a luxury that the powerful can afford to ignore. Lucky was not a good man by any conventional measure. He ordered murders, he profited from addiction and exploitation, he corrupted officials and undermined democratic institutions. But he was successful. He achieved wealth, power, and a place in history. He died of natural causes at 64, a better fate than most criminals achieve. If the universe were just, Lucky Luciano would have faced some kind of cosmic punishment for his crimes. But he did not. He won. He built an empire, transformed an industry, and his legacy endures. What does that say about how the world actually works as opposed to how we wish it worked? These are not comfortable questions, but they are honest ones. Lucky Luciano was a criminal and a killer, but he was also a visionary who understood power better than almost anyone in his era. He saw the future when others clung to the past. He acted decisively when others hesitated. He built structures that outlasted him by generations. And he did it all by recognizing a simple truth. In the end, power belongs to those willing to seize it and ruthless enough to keep it. The night of September 10th, 1931, was not an anomaly. It was not a moment of madness or chaos. It was a calculated restructuring of power executed with precision and purpose. When Lucky Luciano said clean house, he was not expressing anger or fear. He was issuing a command that would echo through the decades. The old order had to die, the new order had to be born, and the men who stood in the way had to be removed, quickly, efficiently, and without mercy. That is what happened on that September night. And the criminal empire that emerged from the blood would shape American history in ways that are still being understood today. So when you think about Lucky Luciano, do not think of him as just another gangster, another violent thug who happened to rise to power. Think of him as a revolutionary, someone who looked at an existing system and decided it needed to be torn down and rebuilt from the ground up. Think of him as an entrepreneur who saw an opportunity and had the courage and the ruthlessness to exploit it. Think of him as an architect who designed structures that would outlast his lifetime. And think of him as a reminder that history is not made by the timid or the moral. History is made by those willing to do what others will not, to see what others cannot, and to act when others hesitate. 40 men died in a single night because one man decided the future could not wait. Their names are mostly forgotten now. Their organizations have faded, their traditions are museum pieces, but the system Lucky Luciano created, the commission, the 5 families, the corporate structure of organized crime that endures, that is his legacy, not the violence, though there was plenty of that, not the money, though he made millions. His legacy is the proof that systems can be transformed, that power can be restructured, and that one person with a clear vision and the will to execute it can change the course of history itself. The question is not whether what Lucky Luciano did was right or wrong. By any moral standard, it was wrong. Murder is wrong. Organized crime is wrong. Corrupting institutions is wrong. But the question that matters is whether we understand what he did and why it worked. Because the principles he applied, identify obstacles, develop a plan, assemble resources, execute decisively, and build structures that outlast individuals, those principles work in any field, legal or illegal. Lucky Luciano was a criminal, but he was also a master strategist, and strategy is strategy regardless of the arena in which it is applied. So the next time you hear about a corporate restructuring, a political purge, a revolutionary movement, or any situation where an old order is being violently replaced by a new one, think about that September night in 1931. Think about Lucky Luciano saying clean house and 40 men dying because they represented the past. Think about how power actually changes hands in the real world. Not through votes or debates or peaceful transitions, through force, through coordination, through the willingness to do what is necessary. That is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story. The world is not shaped by the good or the just. It is shaped by the strong, the smart, and the ruthless. And Lucky Luciano was all 3.